The lawyer's voice cracked when he said my name, and that's when I knew the land my grandfather had promised me for 23 years was about to slip through my fingers like water through a rusted bucket. The inheritance papers sat unsigned on his mahogany desk, still warm from the printer, while outside his window, storm clouds gathered over the mountains where grandfather's cattle ranch stretched across 400 acres of Colorado high country that had belonged to our family since 1887. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Jacob Reeves, 31 years old, and until 3 days ago, I'd been managing a feed supply warehouse in Denver, convinced I'd never see Pine Ridge Ranch again. My grandfather, William Reeves, had raised me there after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. He'd taught me everything about ranching, about reading weather in the way cottonwoods bent, about knowing cattle by the sound of their breathing, about understanding that land doesn't belong to people, people belong to land. Then I'd left at 18, chasing what I thought was a bigger life, breaking his heart in the process. The call came on a Tuesday. Sheriff Tom Brennan's voice had been gentle, practiced from delivering bad news to rural families who lived too far apart to hear it any other way. Jacob, your grandfather passed this morning. Heart gave out while he was mending fence on the north pasture. He was holding a wire cutter when we found him. I'd driven the 6 hours from Denver in a fog, barely registering the transition from city sprawl to open rangeland, from concrete to earth. The ranch appeared exactly as I'd left it 13 years ago, the main house standing proud on a small rise, its log construction weathered but solid, the tin roof catching the last sunlight like hammered silver. The barn, massive and red, sagging slightly on the western side but still standing after a century of mountain winters. The corrals, the equipment sheds, the bunkhouse where ranch hands used to sleep before grandfather couldn't afford to keep them on anymore. The funeral had been small. A handful of neighboring ranchers, their faces carved by wind and sun into expressions of permanent solemnity. Mrs. Patterson from the general store in town. Sheriff Brennan. The Methodist minister who'd known my grandfather for 40 years. They'd buried William Reeves in the family cemetery on the eastern edge of the property, next to my grandmother Catherine, my parents, and 5 generations of Reeves who'd worked this land before him. At the reception afterward, held in the ranch house kitchen where everything smelled of wood smoke and old coffee, neighbors had spoken in low tones about how grandfather had been talking about me in recent months. Said you were coming home, old Frank Morrison had told me, his calloused hand gripping my shoulder. Said he'd finally convinced you where you belonged. But grandfather had never called me. Never written. I'd been the one to cut contact, ashamed of my abandonment, too proud to admit I'd made a mistake leaving. Whatever reconciliation he'd imagined had died with him on that fence line. Now, 3 days later, I sat in Attorney Howard Mitchell's office in the county seat, 20 miles from the ranch, learning that my grandfather's final act had been to leave me everything. The ranch, the cattle, the equipment, the mineral rights, the water rights, everything accumulated across generations of careful stewardship and back-breaking labor. There's a problem, Mitchell said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He was maybe 60, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades navigating the gap between what the law promised and what it actually delivered. First Mountain Bank filed a lien against the property 2 weeks before your grandfather's death. They're claiming he defaulted on a loan taken out 8 months ago, and they're moving to foreclose. The words hit me like cold water. That's impossible. Grandfather would never risk the ranch. He'd sooner cut off his own arm. Mitchell slid a document across the desk. Loan agreement for $375,000, signed by William Reeves last October. According to the bank, he missed the last 3 payments. They're within their legal rights to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I stared at my grandfather's signature on the page, authentic as far as I could tell. What did he need that kind of money for? That's not specified in the loan documents. But Jacob, there's something else. Mitchell pulled out another file, this one thicker. Your grandfather came to see me 6 weeks ago. He wanted to expedite the transfer of the ranch to you while he was still alive, said he had a bad feeling about his health. We'd started the paperwork, but he needed certain financial documents from the bank to complete the process. They kept delaying, saying they needed time to compile records. Then suddenly, 2 weeks before he died, this loan appears in their system. You're saying the loan isn't legitimate? I'm saying the timing is suspicious. Your grandfather banked with First Mountain for 43 years. Then 8 months ago, the bank was acquired by a development corporation called Summit Holdings. New management came in, started aggressively pursuing loans to ranchers in the valley. Several properties have already gone into foreclosure. My jaw tightened. They're trying to take the land. I can't prove that. But I can tell you that Summit Holdings has been buying up properties throughout this county for the past year. There are rumors of a major development project, maybe a resort community or luxury subdivisions. Land like your grandfather's, with water rights and mountain views, would be worth millions to the right buyer. I stood, moving to the window that overlooked Main Street. The county seat was small, maybe 3,000 people, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and strangers were noticed immediately. Out beyond the town limits, I could see the mountains rising, purple in the distance, and somewhere among those peaks was the ranch that had raised me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What are my options? I asked. Mitchell sighed. Legally, you have 30 days from the foreclosure filing to contest the lien or pay the full amount owed. The bank is claiming the total debt, with penalties and interest, is now $412,000. If you can't pay or successfully challenge the loan's legitimacy, they'll auction the property. I don't have that kind of money. I've got maybe $8,000 in savings. Then we need to prove the loan was fraudulent. That means accessing bank records, finding evidence that your grandfather never received the money or never intended to take out the loan. But Summit Holdings has expensive lawyers, and they're not obligated to make this easy. I turned back to face him. How long have we got? 27 days as of today. The foreclosure auction is scheduled for the first Monday of next month. The drive back to the ranch took me through country I'd known since childhood. Rolling grassland giving way to pine forests, the road climbing steadily into the mountains. I passed the Morrison place, where Frank's family had ranched since the 1890s, now reduced to 100 acres after they'd sold off parcels to pay medical bills. The old Brennan homestead, abandoned after the youngest generation moved to cities where there were jobs that didn't break your body by 50. This was the pattern across the rural West. Families who'd held land for generations forced out by economics, by drought, by consolidation, by the simple fact that ranching had become nearly impossible for operations that weren't massive and corporate-backed. My grandfather had held on longer than most, working alone after he couldn't afford hired hands, doing the work of 3 men well into his 70s. And I'd left him to do it alone. The guilt sat heavy in my chest as I pulled up the long gravel drive to the ranch house. The property looked different in the fading afternoon light, more fragile somehow, as if the land itself knew it was threatened. I parked next to my grandfather's truck, a battered Ford F-250 that had to be 20 years old, still caked with mud from whatever work he'd been doing before he died. The house felt cavernous and silent when I stepped inside. My grandfather had been a widower for 15 years, and the place showed it. Clean but sparse, with only the essentials maintained. The living room held furniture older than me, a wood stove for heat, shelves lined with agricultural journals and ranch management books. Family photographs covered one wall, documenting generations of Reeves who'd worked this land. I found myself staring at a picture of my grandfather and me, taken when I was maybe 15. We were standing by the main corral, both of us covered in dust, grinning at the camera. He had his arm around my shoulders, and the pride in his face was unmistakable. Looking at it now, I could barely remember that version of myself, the kid who'd thought he belonged here, who'd understood in his bones what this land meant. In the kitchen, I found a calendar hanging by the phone, my grandfather's handwriting marking various tasks. Rotate cattle to summer pasture. Fix south fence. Vet appointment for breeding stock. The entries stopped 2 weeks ago, his routine interrupted by whatever had happened with the bank. I started searching, not sure what I was looking for but knowing there had to be more to the story. My grandfather had been meticulous about record keeping, every receipt saved, every transaction documented. His office was a small room off the main hallway, dominated by a steel desk that had probably come from some government surplus sale decades ago. The desk drawers were locked. I searched for keys, checking the obvious places. Kitchen drawer, bedroom nightstand, hooks by the front door. Nothing. Finally, I remembered a habit from childhood, my grandfather keeping important keys in a tobacco tin on the top shelf of the pantry, behind the flour and sugar canisters. The tin was there, dusty and dented. Inside were 3 keys and a folded piece of paper. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded it. The note was in my grandfather's precise handwriting, dated 6 weeks before his death. Jacob, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've come home. I knew you would. The ranch is yours now, like it should have been all along. What I'm about to tell you, I should have told you years ago, but pride and stubbornness kept me silent. The land under our feet is worth more than you know. Not just the surface rights, but what's beneath. 3 years ago, a geological survey team contacted me about rare earth minerals in the mountain range that runs through our northern pastures. Elements used in computer chips, electric car batteries, renewable energy systems. They estimated deposits potentially worth tens of millions of dollars. I turned them away. This is cattle land, has been for 137 years, and I wasn't about to let it be torn up by mining operations. But word got out somehow. Companies started circling. One in particular, Summit Holdings, made offers, sent representatives, tried everything to convince me to sell. When I refused, things got complicated. If you're facing trouble from the bank, know this: I never took out any loan. I never needed to. The ranch has been free and clear since 1973. Whatever documents they're showing you are fabricated. The proof is in the safe behind the bookshelf in my office. Remember what I taught you about the combination. Your grandmother's birthday, the year we bought our first Angus bull, and the number of acres in the original homestead. Trust Sheriff Brennan. He's honest. Don't trust the new bank manager, Richard Coulter. He works for Summit. Fight for this land, Jacob. Not because I'm asking you to, but because it's worth fighting for. Because it's home. And because if you don't, everything our family built will be strip-mined into nothing. Welcome home, son. I forgive you for leaving. Now forgive yourself, and do what needs doing. William Reeves. I read the note 3 times, my grandfather's voice clear in every word. Then I moved to his office, pulling books from the shelf until I found the one that triggered the release mechanism. The shelf swung out on hidden hinges, revealing a wall safe I'd never known existed. The combination came easily. Catherine's birthday, April 14th. The year they'd bought their foundation bull, 1971. The acres in the original homestead, 160. The safe clicked open. Inside were manila folders stuffed with documents. Survey reports showing mineral deposits in detailed geological maps. Correspondence from multiple companies trying to negotiate purchase or mining rights. Financial records proving the ranch had no outstanding debts. And most damning, a series of photographs showing the new bank manager, Richard Coulter, meeting with men in expensive suits outside the bank, timestamps dating back 8 months. The last item was a ledger, my grandfather's meticulous accounting of every attempt to pressure him into selling. Dates, names, tactics used. It read like a campaign of harassment disguised as legitimate business. As darkness fell outside and I sat surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy to steal my family's land, I understood something fundamental had shifted. I'd come back for a funeral, planning to sell the estate and return to my warehouse job in Denver. Now I was looking at a fight that would determine whether 400 acres of mountain country remained a working ranch or became another casualty of corporate greed. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Reeves, this is Richard Coulter from First Mountain Bank. I understand you're contesting the foreclosure. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss settlement options. We can make this easier for everyone involved. 10 a.m. at the bank. I stared at the message, then at my grandfather's note, then out the window at land that had been in my family for nearly a century and a half. The cattle were out there somewhere in the darkness, probably bedded down in the summer pastures. The fence lines my grandfather had died maintaining stretched across terrain he'd known better than his own hands. The water that ran through our creeks and springs fed not just our operation but 3 ranches downstream. This wasn't just about me or even about honoring my grandfather's memory. This was about whether land that had sustained generations would survive to sustain generations more. I typed a response to Coulter. "I'll be there." Then I called Sheriff Brennan. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff but alert despite the late hour. "Tom, it's Jacob Reeves. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Did my grandfather ever mention taking out a loan?" There was a long pause. "No. In fact, he specifically told me 3 months ago that the ranch was debt-free and he intended to keep it that way." "Why?" "Because the bank claims he borrowed $375,000, and they're foreclosing. But I found a note he left me. He says the loan is fake." Another pause, longer this time. "Jacob, there's something you should know. Your grandfather came to me 6 weeks before he died. Said he was being followed, that his mail was being tampered with, that someone had tried to access his bank accounts. I thought maybe he was getting paranoid in his old age, but I ran some quiet checks. Found surveillance equipment on his property. Professional grade." My blood ran cold. "Where?" "Near the North Pasture Access Road. The same area where those mineral surveys were conducted. I had it removed, but I couldn't prove who placed it. Your grandfather made me promise not to tell you unless something happened to him. He didn't want you worrying, didn't want you coming back out of obligation. He's dead, Tom. That's what happened." "I know. And I've been waiting for you to call." The sheriff's voice hardened. "Meet me at the ranch tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., before your bank appointment. There are things you need to see." Sheriff Tom Brennan arrived at dawn in an unmarked truck, not his patrol vehicle. That detail alone told me we were operating outside official channels. He stepped out wearing ranch clothes rather than his uniform, a weathered Carhartt jacket over worn jeans, boots that had seen real work. At 62, Tom had been sheriff for 26 years, but before that he'd run cattle with his father on land that bordered ours to the east. "Coffee's on," I said from the porch. He nodded, following me inside without small talk. We sat at the kitchen table where generations of Reeves had planned seasons and weathered hardships, the morning light just beginning to filter through windows that needed cleaning. "Your grandfather was right to be worried," Tom said, pulling a folder from inside his jacket. "After he died, I did some digging that I probably shouldn't have. Called in favors from people who owe me. What I found isn't pretty." He spread photographs across the table. Surveillance images of my grandfather going about his daily routine. At the feed store. Checking cattle. Working fence line. The timestamps covered the last 8 months of his life. "Who took these?" "Private security firm out of Denver. Contracted by Summit Holdings. They've been watching everyone who owns significant acreage in this valley. Your grandfather, the Morrisons, the Chin family over on Bitter Creek, anyone sitting on land they want." I picked up one photo, my grandfather's face captured in profile as he loaded feed bags. Something about seeing him through a stranger's lens, reduced to a surveillance subject, made my hands shake with barely contained rage. "There's more," Tom continued. "Summit Holdings is a shell corporation. Took me 3 days to trace the ownership structure, but I finally connected it. The real money comes from Apex Resource Development. They're a multinational mining company that's been buying up mineral rights across the Rockies. The rare earth deposits under your land? They're part of a deposit that runs through this entire valley. Geological surveys estimate it's worth north of $200 million. The number was incomprehensible, too large to process against the reality of ranch life measured in cattle prices and hay costs. Why not just make a fair offer? Why all this? Tom's jaw tightened. Because ranchers like your grandfather don't sell. They can't be bought at any price because the land means more than money. So Summit developed a different strategy. Get control of the banks, manufacture debt, foreclose, acquire the properties for pennies on the dollar. They've already done it to 4 operations in the county. Yours would be the 5th. I thought of my grandfather alone in his last months, knowing he was being watched, knowing someone was trying to take everything he'd built. The loan documents. How did they fake his signature? That's where it gets complicated. Richard Coulter, the bank manager, he's not just an employee. He's a partner in Summit Holdings. I believe he had access to your grandfather's signature from legitimate banking documents going back decades. With modern technology, forging a signature on loan papers isn't difficult. The trick is making sure the loan enters the system in a way that looks legitimate, backdated with all the right timestamps and paperwork. Can we prove it's fake? Tom hesitated. Your grandfather's note helps. The financial records showing no debt help. But Summit has lawyers who specialize in making fraud look legal. They'll argue the documents are genuine, that your grandfather simply didn't tell anyone about the loan, maybe because he was getting forgetful in his old age. He wasn't forgetful. He was sharper at 76 than most people at 40. I know that. You know that. But a court might be convinced otherwise, especially with Summit's resources backing the argument. They'll drag this out, bury you in legal costs you can't afford, wait until you're forced to settle. I stood, moving to the window that looked out over the main pasture. In the growing light, I could see cattle beginning to move, dark shapes against pale grass. Angus and Hereford crosses, good stock that my grandfather had spent decades improving through careful breeding. Beyond them, the land rose toward the mountains, fence lines marking boundaries that predated Colorado statehood. What about the surveillance equipment you found? I kept it. Documented where it was placed, took photographs, preserved the chain of evidence. But private surveillance on private land isn't necessarily illegal if they had permission to be on neighboring property with sight lines to yours. Summit could argue they were doing environmental surveys or property assessments. My grandfather's death, I said slowly, not wanting to voice the thought but unable to avoid it. You think it was natural? Tom was quiet for a long moment. The coroner ruled it a heart attack. Your grandfather had a history of heart disease, was on medication. At 76, working alone on fence line in heat, it's not suspicious on its face. He paused. But the timing bothers me. He dies 2 weeks after the fraudulent loan appears in the system, just as he was trying to transfer the ranch to you. Before he could complete the paperwork that would have made the foreclosure impossible. The implication hung between us like smoke. I turned from the window to face Tom directly. You think they killed him? I think convenient deaths happen sometimes. I think stress can trigger heart attacks. I think a man who's being watched and threatened and fighting to protect his land might experience the kind of stress that stops a 76-year-old heart. Tom met my eyes. I also think I can't prove anything, and even suggesting it would get me laughed out of any official investigation. The sun had fully risen now, painting the kitchen in warm light that felt wrong against the darkness of our conversation. Outside, the ranch looked peaceful, timeless, exactly as it had looked for generations. But underneath that surface, something had rotted, turned predatory. What do you suggest I do? Tom gathered his photographs back into the folder. Go to your bank meeting. Record everything if Colorado's single-party consent law allows it, which it does. Let Coulter make his pitch. See what he offers. But Jacob, understand something. These people have resources you can't match. They've already won this fight 4 times in this county. They know how to manipulate the system because they've spent years learning how. So I should give up. Let them take it? I'm saying you need to be smart. Your grandfather spent 8 months fighting them and died alone on a fence line. You've got 27 days before the auction. That's not enough time to win through conventional channels. I studied the older man's face, reading the subtext in his careful words. What are you really saying, Tom? He stood, moving toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. I'm saying your grandfather was a careful man. He left you that note for a reason. He documented everything for a reason. And he had evidence in a safe behind a false bookshelf for a reason. Tom turned to look at me directly. I'm saying that sometimes, when the system is rigged, you have to find other ways to fight. Legal ways. But creative. After he left, I spent an hour going through my grandfather's safe again, this time looking for what I'd missed. The survey reports detailed the mineral deposits with scientific precision. The correspondence showed escalating pressure from Summit Holdings, offers starting at $2 million and climbing to $5 million, then veiled threats when my grandfather continued refusing. But it was the ledger that proved most valuable. My grandfather had documented every interaction, every irregularity. A note that his mail had been opened and resealed. Records of phone calls from blocked numbers making vague warnings. Observations of vehicles parked on public roads with clear sight lines to the ranch. A detailed timeline that painted a picture of systematic harassment. One entry from 4 months ago stopped me cold. Received letter from Denver law firm representing Summit Holdings. They claim there are irregularities in the original homestead patent from 1887. Threatening to challenge our title to the land based on allegedly improper filing procedures from 137 years ago. This is harassment, pure and simple. They're trying to find any angle to create doubt about our ownership. Met with Howard Mitchell. He says the claim is baseless, but defending against it would cost $50,000 in legal fees. I told them to pound sand. My grandfather had been fighting on multiple fronts, each attack designed to wear him down, force mistakes, create vulnerability. The loan fraud was just the strategy that finally worked. I arrived at First Mountain Bank at 9:45, early enough to observe but not so early as to seem anxious. The building was new, constructed after Summit Holdings acquired the previous community bank. All glass and steel, aggressively modern against the modest downtown storefronts around it. A corporate statement in a town that had never needed one. Richard Coulter's office was on the second floor, with windows overlooking Main Street. He stood when I entered, extending a hand with the practiced warmth of someone who'd been trained in customer relations. Late 40s, expensive suit, teeth too white to be natural. Everything about him said outsider, corporate professional dropped into rural Colorado with no connection to the land or the people who worked it. Mr. Reeves, thank you for coming. Please, sit. Can I get you coffee? Water? I'm fine. I settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the framed diplomas on the wall. Business degree from USC, MBA from Stanford. A photograph showed Coulter shaking hands with someone I didn't recognize at what looked like a resort conference. I was very sorry to hear about your grandfather, Coulter began, his tone calibrated for sympathy. William was a respected member of this community. You never met him. A flicker of surprise crossed Coulter's face. I had the pleasure several times when he came in for banking business. My grandfather stopped coming to this bank 8 months ago. Right around the time Summit Holdings took over. He moved his accounts to the credit union in Millerville. I pulled out my phone, opening the recording app. I'm going to record this conversation. Colorado is a single-party consent state, so I'm informing you as a courtesy. Coulter's professional smile tightened. That's your right, of course. Though I'm not sure why you feel it's necessary for what I hope will be a productive discussion. The loan you claim my grandfather took out. I'd like to see the original documents. Not copies. The actual paperwork with his physical signature. Those documents are in our vault, part of our secure records. We don't typically release originals for routine consultations. This isn't routine. You're foreclosing on my family's ranch based on a loan I believe is fraudulent. I want to see proof that my grandfather actually signed for $375,000. Coulter's expression shifted, the warmth evaporating. Mr. Reeves, I understand you're upset. Losing a family property is emotional. But the loan is legally documented and properly executed. Your grandfather signed the agreement, received the funds, and unfortunately failed to meet the repayment terms. Show me the bank transfer. If he received $375,000, there should be a record of where that money went. The funds were disbursed by cashier's check at your grandfather's request. He didn't want the money deposited into his account. Why would a 76-year-old rancher who'd been debt-free for decades suddenly need a cashier's check for that amount? What was the stated purpose of the loan? Coulter consulted his computer screen. Property improvements and operating expenses. My grandfather ran a modest operation. His annual expenses were maybe $60,000 including everything. He had cash reserves to cover that. What property improvements would cost $375,000? I don't speculate on how clients choose to use their funds. The loan was approved based on the land value as collateral. That's standard procedure. I leaned forward. Here's what I think happened. Summit Holdings wanted my grandfather's land because of the rare earth minerals underneath it. When he wouldn't sell, you created a fake loan to manufacture debt. You forged his signature using samples from old banking documents, backdated the paperwork, and entered it into your system. Now you're foreclosing to acquire 400 acres worth millions for the price of an unpaid loan. Coulter's face remained professionally neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition that I knew more than he'd anticipated. That's quite an accusation, Mr. Reeves. And completely unfounded. If you're making allegations of fraud, I suggest you contact authorities and pursue formal channels. I plan to. But first, I'm offering you a chance to make this right. Withdraw the foreclosure claim. Admit the loan was an error in your system. Let me keep the property my family has owned for 137 years. I'm afraid I can't do that. The loan is legitimate, and the bank has a fiduciary responsibility to its investors. Coulter stood, signaling the meeting's end. However, I am authorized to offer you a settlement. Summit Holdings is prepared to purchase the property for $1.2 million. That's well above the loan amount and would leave you with a substantial profit. You could start fresh somewhere else, free of the burden of maintaining such a large operation alone. There it was. The real offer. Not a resolution of the fake debt, but an acquisition disguised as generosity. The rare earth deposits under that land are worth $200 million. You're offering me 0.5% of the actual value. Coulter's mask slipped further. Mineral deposits are speculative. Extraction costs, environmental permits, market fluctuations, all of that affects actual value. $1.2 million is a fair offer for a cattle ranch in declining condition. My answer is no. I'm fighting the foreclosure. And I'm going public with what Summit is doing to ranchers in this valley. That would be unwise. The threat in Coulter's voice was barely veiled. Making false accusations against a respected financial institution could expose you to defamation liability. You're already facing significant debt. Adding legal judgments would only worsen your situation. I stood, meeting his eyes. My grandfather didn't back down when you threatened him. Neither will I. Your grandfather's stubbornness led to unfortunate consequences. I'd hate to see you follow the same path. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I forced myself to stay calm, to not react to what might have been an admission or might have been nothing more than corporate callousness. 27 days, I said. That's how long I have before the auction. I'm going to use every minute of it to expose what you've done. Outside the bank, my hands shook as I stopped the recording. I sat in my grandfather's truck, breathing deeply, trying to process what had just happened. Coulter's final words echoed in my mind. Unfortunate consequences. A veiled reference to my grandfather's death or just a callous observation about the foreclosure? My phone rang. Howard Mitchell, the attorney. Jacob, we need to talk. I just received a filing from Summit Holdings. They're accelerating the timeline. The foreclosure auction has been moved up to 14 days from now. They're claiming additional irregularities in the estate transfer that require expedited resolution. Can they do that? With the right legal justification, yes. And they're arguing that since you're not the official property owner yet, the estate is in limbo, which allows them to push for faster resolution. It's aggressive, but probably within legal bounds. 14 days instead of 27. They were tightening the noose, moving faster than I could organize a defense. What do we do? I'm filing an emergency motion to halt the acceleration. But Jacob, I need to be honest with you. Summit has resources I can't match. Every motion I file, they'll counter with 3. Every argument I make, they'll bury in paperwork. Unless we find something definitive, something that proves fraud beyond any doubt, I'm not sure we can win this through conventional legal channels. After hanging up, I drove aimlessly for an hour, winding through back roads that crisscrossed the valley. I passed the Morrison Ranch, its acreage reduced by decades of slow decline. The old Brennan homestead, windows dark and empty. The Chen property, still operational but struggling like everyone else. This was the pattern. Families that had held land for generations, worn down by economics and time and now targeted by corporations that saw only resources to extract, profits to maximize. My grandfather had been one defender among many, and he'd died trying to hold the line. I found myself on the northern edge of our property, where the fence line bordered national forest. This was where my grandfather had died, where they'd found him with wire cutters still in his hand. The fence was mended now, Tom Brennan's doing probably, but I could see where the old wire had been replaced. Standing there in the afternoon sun, looking out over land that rose toward distant peaks, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't just about me or even about my grandfather's memory. This was about whether the land itself would survive as working ranch or be torn apart by mining operations that would leave nothing but scarred earth and poison water. The cattle needed me. The grass needed managed grazing to stay healthy. The springs and creeks needed protected from contamination. The soil needed the cycle of hooves and manure and seasons to maintain its richness. Take away the ranching, replace it with industrial extraction, and you didn't just change ownership. You destroyed an entire ecosystem that had taken a century to develop. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Stop digging or face consequences. This is your only warning." I screenshot the message and forwarded it to Tom Brennan, then to Howard Mitchell. Evidence of intimidation, probably not enough to change anything legally, but more documentation of Summit's tactics. Another text, this one from an actual contact. "Dr. Sarachin, whose family ran the ranch on Bitter Creek, heard you're fighting Summit. My father wants to talk. Says we can't let them take another property. Come by tonight if you can." The Chin Ranch was 20 minutes west, a smaller operation than ours but well managed. I'd known Sarah growing up, had gone to school with her before I left for Denver. She'd stayed, earned a veterinary degree, come back to help her aging parents keep their land productive. I texted back, "I'll be there at 7. As I drove back to the house, I realized the fight had shifted. This wasn't just my battle anymore. Other families were watching, waiting to see if anyone could stand against Summit Holdings. My grandfather had fought alone. But maybe I didn't have to. The sun was setting when I pulled into the ranch yard, painting the mountains in shades of amber and purple. The cattle were silhouetted against the fading light, peacefully grazing, unaware that their future hung in the balance of legal maneuvers and corporate greed. Inside, I made coffee and returned to my grandfather's ledger, reading it cover to cover, looking for anything I'd missed. His handwriting became less steady in the final entries, stress and age taking their toll. But his determination never wavered. Every observation was precise, every detail documented. The last entry, dated 3 days before his death, was just 2 sentences: "They think they can wait me out. They don't understand what this land means." I traced the words with my finger, feeling the indentation where his pen had pressed hard into the paper. He'd been right. They didn't understand. To Summit Holdings, this was just another acquisition, another resource to exploit. They couldn't comprehend what it meant to belong to a place, to have your identity woven into soil and grass and mountains. But I understood. Finally, after 13 years away, After choosing the city and walking away from everything my grandfather had tried to teach me, I understood. The land wasn't just property. It was responsibility, legacy, the accumulated work of everyone who'd come before. Losing it would break something that couldn't be measured in dollars or replaced by starting fresh somewhere else. At 6:45, I headed to the Chin Ranch, my grandfather's ledger on the seat beside me, the weight of 14 days pressing down like a coming storm. The Chin Ranch house glowed with warm light against the gathering darkness, vehicles already parked in the gravel lot when I arrived. Sarah met me at the door, her face showing the same weathered determination I'd seen on every rancher who'd managed to hold on to their land through sheer stubbornness and dawn-to-dusk work. "Jacob. It's been a long time." She gripped my hand with calloused fingers, no pretense of softness. "Dad's in the living room with the others. We've been waiting for someone to stand up to Summit. Your grandfather tried alone. We're not making that mistake again." Inside, I found 6 people gathered around a coffee table covered in maps and documents. Frank Morrison, looking older than he had at the funeral. Tom Brennan in civilian clothes, his sheriff's authority set aside for the evening. Sarah's father, James Chen, 73 but still ranch hard. 2 people I didn't recognize, a younger couple maybe in their 40s. And Howard Mitchell, my attorney, his presence suggesting this was more than a social gathering. "Jacob," James Chen stood, his handshake firm despite arthritis-gnarled fingers. "Your grandfather was a good man. Smart. Careful. If he left you that ranch, it's because he knew you'd come to understand what it means." "I'm not sure I'm there yet," I admitted. "You came back. You're fighting. That's enough for now." James gestured to the others. "You know Frank and Tom and Howard. This is Marcus and Elena Rodriguez. They own the property adjacent to yours on the south side." Marcus stood, extending his hand. "We got the same treatment from Summit last year. Fabricated loan, foreclosure threats, the whole playbook. We settled rather than fight because we couldn't afford the legal battle. Sold them 60 acres of our 200. Been regretting it ever since. They're strip mining it now," Elena added quietly, her voice carrying the weight of witness destruction. "Took them 4 months to tear up land that had been in Marcus's family since 1902. The runoff is contaminating Bitter Creek. Our cattle won't drink from it anymore." I looked at the maps on the table, seeing the pattern clearly now. Summit Holdings had been systematically acquiring properties, creating a patchwork of owned and controlled land across the valley. My grandfather's ranch was one of the last holdouts in a strategic corridor that would connect their existing holdings. "How many properties have they taken?" I asked. "For completed foreclosures," Howard said. 3 settlements like the Rodriguez family. 7 more ranches are facing various forms of pressure. Tax assessment challenges, disputed water rights, environmental violation claims, anything to create legal complications and debt. Tom Brennan spread out a larger regional map, marking properties with colored pins. Red for Summit acquisitions, yellow for properties under pressure, green for those still free and clear. The pattern was unmistakable, a corporate campaign to control the entire valley. "The rare earth minerals," Tom said, pointing to geological survey overlays. "The deposit runs through all of this. If Summit controls enough contiguous property, they can establish a major mining operation. Your grandfather's ranch sits right in the middle of the most concentrated deposits. Without it, their mining plan has a 400-acre gap they'd have to work around. So if I can hold the property, it disrupts their entire operation." "More than disrupts," James Chen interjected. "Environmental regulations require buffer zones around active mining sites. If your ranch remains a working cattle operation, it creates regulatory complications for everything they want to do. One property owner has rights that can slow down or even prevent adjacent industrial development." Sarah pulled out another document, this one a technical environmental impact study. "I've been researching this for 6 months, since Summit started pressuring Dad. Colorado law requires extensive environmental review for any mining operation near active agricultural land with water resources. Your ranch has 3 natural springs that feed into the watershed. If those get contaminated, it affects everyone downstream. I studied the maps, the survey data, the legal framework they'd assembled. These people had been preparing for this fight, gathering ammunition against an enemy that had already taken too much. "What's the plan?" I asked. Howard Mitchell adjusted his glasses, the gesture familiar from our earlier meetings. "The foreclosure acceleration gives us 14 days. That's not enough time to conclusively prove loan fraud through normal discovery processes. But it might be enough time to create such significant legal complications that Summit decides your property isn't worth the trouble." "How?" "Multiple fronts. First, I'm filing an emergency motion challenging the loan's validity based on your grandfather's documented financial history. The evidence you found helps, but it's not conclusive on its own. Second, Sarah's environmental research gives us grounds to request a preliminary injunction against any property transfer pending environmental impact assessment. If we can argue that Summit's ultimate intent is mining development, we can require they prove the transfer won't harm water resources." Tom leaned back in his chair. "Third, and this is where it gets interesting, I've been in contact with the FBI's white-collar crime division. They're already investigating Summit Holdings for bank fraud in 3 other states. Your case could be part of a larger pattern. If federal investigators request a hold on the foreclosure pending their investigation, that supersedes the local auction timeline. Will they do that?" "I sent them everything yesterday. Your grandfather's ledger, the surveillance photos, the loan documents, the timeline. They're interested. But federal bureaucracy moves slow, even when they're motivated. We might get intervention in time, or we might not." Frank Morrison, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "There's a 4th front. Public pressure. Summit has been operating in shadows, using legal complexity to hide what they're doing. If we go public, bring media attention to how they're systematically destroying ranching families, it creates problems they didn't plan for." "They threatened me today," I said. "Sent a text warning me to stop digging or face consequences." Tom's expression hardened. "Forward that to me." Intimidation adds another layer to the federal case. Elena Rodriguez touched her husband's arm gently. "We should tell him about the documents." Marcus nodded slowly. "When we settled with Summit, they made us sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. We weren't supposed to talk about the terms or their tactics. But Elena photographed everything before we turned over the originals. If we break the NDA and share those documents, we'll face legal penalties. But it might be worth it to stop them from doing to you what they did to us." The risk in their offer was substantial. Financial penalties that could destroy what remained of their operation. But they were willing to take that hit to help someone they barely knew beyond shared community bonds and common cause. "I can't ask you to do that," I said. "You're not asking. We're offering." Elena pulled out her phone. "These documents show Summit's entire playbook. How they fabricate loans, how they coordinate with their banking subsidiary, how they time everything to prevent effective legal response. Your attorney can use this." Howard took the phone, scrolling through the images, his expression shifting from interest to something approaching excitement. They documented everything. The internal communications, the strategic planning, the deliberate fraud. If this is authentic, it's devastating." "It's authentic," Marcus said. "We lived through it. We know it's real." Sarah stood, moving to the window that looked out over their land. "My family came here in 1893. Chinese immigrants who worked the railroad, then saved enough to buy land when nobody else wanted to sell to them. We've held this place through discrimination, through depression, through drought. I'm not letting some corporate raiders take it without a fight, even if we're not the ones directly threatened right now." James Chin joined his daughter at the window. "Your grandfather understood something important, Jacob. The land doesn't belong to any of us. We're temporary. Caretakers for a few decades if we're lucky. Our job is to protect it for whoever comes next. When we lose sight of that, when we start thinking about land as just a commodity to be bought and sold, we lose something essential about who we are. The weight of generations pressed down on the room. Every person here represented families who'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. Who'd worked themselves to exhaustion maintaining operations that barely broke even financially but provided something money couldn't measure. Connection to place. Purpose rooted in soil and seasons. The stubborn insistence that some things were worth preserving even when the economics didn't make sense. What happens if we lose? I asked quietly. Tom Brennan answered. Summit completes their acquisition. Mining operations begin within 6 months. The valley we've known our entire lives gets torn up for minerals that'll be gone in 20 years. The watershed gets contaminated. The ranches downstream fail when their cattle can't drink the water. The town shrinks as families leave. In 30 years, there'll be nothing here but abandoned equipment and poison earth. And if we win? We prove that community still means something. That you can't just buy everything and everyone. That some fights are worth having even when you're outmatched. He paused. And we keep a way of life going for at least another generation. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, each person contributing what they knew, what they'd experienced, what resources they could offer. By the time we dispersed near midnight, we had a coordinated strategy. Howard would file multiple legal motions designed to create maximum complexity. Sarah would submit her environmental research to state regulatory agencies. Tom would push the federal investigation. The Rodriguez family would provide their documented evidence despite the personal cost. And I would do what my grandfather had done, document everything, stay visible, refuse to be intimidated into silence. Driving home through darkness broken only by my headlights, I felt something shift inside me. The isolation I'd carried since coming back, the burden of fighting alone, had lifted slightly. My grandfather had died thinking he was the only one willing to resist. But he'd been wrong. The community had been waiting for someone to take point, to be visible enough that others could rally around them. The ranch house was dark when I arrived, but I didn't turn on lights immediately. Instead, I sat on the porch in the cool night air, listening to the sounds of cattle settling in distant pastures, the whisper of wind through grass, the creek running somewhere in the darkness. My phone buzzed with an email from Howard Mitchell, sent at 12:30 in the morning. The subject line read, Breakthrough. I opened it with shaking hands. Jacob, the Rodriguez documents included internal communications from Richard Coulter to Summit Holdings executives. In one email, dated 2 weeks before your grandfather's death, Coulter writes, Reeves remains uncooperative. Recommend increasing pressure through all available channels. Subject is elderly and isolated. Sustained stress should create the desired outcome within 30 days. I'm forwarding this to the FBI tonight. This may constitute evidence of conspiracy to cause harm. Combined with the timing of your grandfather's death, it opens an entirely new avenue of investigation. Call me first thing in the morning. Howard, I read the email 3 times, my grandfather's face clear in my mind. Sustained stress should create the desired outcome. They'd known his heart was weak. They'd deliberately increased pressure, watching, waiting for his body to give out. It wasn't murder in the legal sense, but it was close enough that the distinction felt meaningless. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night going through my grandfather's journals again, this time seeing them not just as documentation but as conversation with a man I'd never properly known. He'd written about the land with precision and love. About cattle genetics and grass management and water flow patterns. About the satisfaction of work done well and seasons turning in their proper rhythm. But he'd also written about loneliness. About missing my grandmother. About wishing his grandson would come home but being too proud to ask. About understanding why I'd left even as it broke his heart. One entry from 5 years ago stopped me. Jacob called today. Just to check in, he said, but I could hear the city in his voice. The rush, the constant noise. He asked if I ever thought about selling, moving somewhere easier. I told him no. But I didn't tell him what I should have. That this land is easy compared to living anywhere else. That the work might break your body but it doesn't break your spirit. That belonging to a place is the closest thing I've found to peace since Catherine died. I hope someday he understands. But I won't force it. A man has to find his own way home. Dawn found me still on the porch, the journal closed on my lap, tears I hadn't known I was crying cold on my face. My grandfather had forgiven me years ago for leaving. Had understood better than I had why I'd needed to go. And he'd been waiting patiently for me to find my way back, never demanding, never making me feel guilty, just keeping the land ready for when I was ready for it. The irony cut deep. I'd finally come home, finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me, but only because he'd died leaving me no choice. The reconciliation he'd hoped for had happened too late for him to witness. Over the next 10 days, events moved with surprising speed. The FBI opened a formal investigation into Summit Holdings' banking practices, requesting all foreclosure proceedings be frozen pending review. A federal judge granted a temporary injunction, pushing the auction date back by 60 days while investigators examined the Rodriguez documents and other evidence. Richard Coulter was placed on administrative leave from First Mountain Bank. His communications with Summit Holdings executives revealed a pattern of fraud extending beyond my case to potentially dozens of properties across multiple states. State environmental regulators, responding to Sarah Chen's research, announced a comprehensive review of mining permit applications in the valley, citing concerns about watershed contamination and inadequate impact assessment. Local media picked up the story, framing it as family ranchers fighting corporate exploitation. Then regional outlets followed. Within a week, we had reporters from Denver interviewing neighboring ranchers about Summit's tactics. The pressure that had been applied in shadow now faced daylight, and Summit's executives found themselves answering uncomfortable questions in public. But the cost was real. The Rodriguez family faced a lawsuit for breaking their NDA, with Summit seeking damages that could bankrupt their operation. Tom Brennan received official complaints about his investigation, political pressure from county officials who'd apparently received campaign contributions from Summit-affiliated entities. Sarah Chen's veterinary practice lost several corporate farming clients who didn't want to be associated with the controversy. Everyone who'd chosen to fight was paying a price. The easy path would have been to stay silent, accept that the system was rigged, let Summit have what it wanted. But they'd all decided that some things were worth protecting regardless of personal cost. On the 14th day, I was in the north pasture checking fence line when Howard Mitchell called. "Jacob, you need to sit down for this." I leaned against a fence post, the same one my grandfather had been working on when he died. "Just tell me." Summit Holdings is withdrawing the foreclosure claim. They're also withdrawing all loan documentation and admitting there were irregularities in their record-keeping that require further internal review. They're not admitting fraud directly, but they're backing off completely. I couldn't process the words for a moment. We won. You won. The FBI investigation is continuing, and Summit will likely face criminal charges for their broader fraud scheme. But as far as your property goes, you're clear. The ranch is yours, free and clear, exactly as your grandfather intended. After hanging up, I stood in the pasture for a long time, watching cattle graze against distant mountains. The land looked exactly as it had yesterday, as it had for decades. But something fundamental had changed. It was mine now. Not just legally, but in the sense that I'd fought for it, bled for it, understood what protecting it really meant. That evening, I returned to the family cemetery on the eastern edge of the property. My grandfather's grave was still fresh, the earth not yet settled, grass not yet grown over the disturbed soil. I knelt beside the marker, simple granite with his name and dates, no elaborate epitaph. We won, I told him. The ranch is safe. The land is protected. And I'm staying. I'm not going back to Denver. I'm not walking away again. This is home, and I finally understand what you were trying to tell me all those years. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and pine. In the distance, a hawk called, its cry clear in the mountain air. The sun touched the peaks, painting them gold and purple, the same colors I'd seen 1,000 times growing up but had forgotten in 13 years away. I'm sorry it took me so long, I continued. Sorry I left you alone. Sorry I didn't understand that some things are more important than career advancement or city convenience. You were right about all of it. The land, the work, the belonging. I just had to lose it to understand what it meant. I stayed until full darkness, talking to my grandfather in a way I'd never managed when he was alive. Telling him about the people who'd fought beside me, about their courage and sacrifice. About how his careful documentation had given us the evidence we needed. About how his refusal to give up had inspired others to stand firm. Finally, I stood, touching the cold granite one last time. I'll take care of it, I promised. The ranch, the cattle, the land. I'll be the caretaker you trained me to be. And someday, when I'm old and it's my turn, I'll pass it on to someone who understands what we're protecting here. Not just property. Not just a business. But a way of life that says some things are worth more than money. That belonging to a place, being responsible for it, is what makes us human. Walking back to the house through darkness, I thought about the work ahead. Fences to mend. Cattle to manage. Hay to put up before winter. The same seasonal rhythms that had governed this land for generations. The work would be hard, endless, sometimes heartbreaking. But it would be mine, and it would matter in ways that my warehouse job never had. The ranch house lights glowed warm in the distance, waiting for me. Tomorrow I'd start making it truly home, not just my grandfather's place I was occupying, but mine. I'd fill it with life again, maybe find someone to share it with eventually, build a future rooted in the same soil that had sustained my family for nearly a century and a half. But tonight, I sat on the porch one more time, looking out over land I'd almost lost, land that had been saved not by money or lawyers but by community and stubbornness and the determination to protect something worth protecting. In the darkness, I imagined I could hear my grandfather's voice, carried on the wind. Not words exactly, but a feeling. Approval. Forgiveness. Welcome home. The land had tested me, nearly broken me, forced me to become someone different than the person who'd left 13 years ago. But it had also given me back something I'd lost without knowing it. Purpose. Belonging. The understanding that legacy isn't about what you inherit, but what you choose to protect and pass on. I belonged here. Finally, completely, without reservation. The ranch was mine, and I was the ranch's. That reciprocal relationship, that mutual belonging, was what my grandfather had spent decades trying to teach me. Now, with him gone and the land secure, I finally understood. The lesson had cost everything to learn. But some lessons are worth the price. In the morning, I'd start the work of ranching. But tonight, I sat with gratitude and grief in equal measure, a man who'd found his way home just in time to save it, who'd learned what it means to fight for something bigger than himself, who'd discovered that the truest inheritance isn't land or money but the wisdom to know what's worth protecting and the courage to protect it. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the mountain darkness. The same stars my great-great-grandfather had seen when he first claimed this land in 1887. The same stars my grandfather had watched while building and protecting what they'd started. And now the same stars I would watch while carrying the work forward. 400 acres of Colorado high country. Cattle and grass and mountains. Water running clear through creeks that had never run dry. Soil enriched by a century of careful stewardship. And the knowledge that I'd fought for it, earned it, claimed it not through purchase or inheritance alone but through understanding what it meant and refusing to let it be destroyed. The land will protect the truth, my grandfather had written. And in the end, it had. Not through magic or sentiment, but through the simple fact that when people understand what's worth saving, they find the strength to save it. I was home. Finally, truly, irrevocably home. And I would never leave again. The first snow came early that year, dusting the high pastures in mid-October while the cattle were still grazing summer range. I spent 3 days moving them down to lower elevations, work that would have taken my grandfather a week doing it alone. But I wasn't alone anymore. Marcus Rodriguez rode beside me, his knowledge of the land compensating for skills I was still relearning. Sarich met us at the lower corrals with her veterinary kit, checking each animal as we brought them through, making sure everyone was healthy enough to face the winter ahead. This was the rhythm we'd fallen into over the past 8 months. Neighboring ranchers helping each other the way it had been done for generations before corporations in isolation had fractured the community. What Summit Holdings had tried to destroy through division, they'd accidentally strengthened through opposition. We'd learned we were stronger together than any of us had been standing alone. The legal aftermath continued playing out in courts and federal investigations, but it had moved beyond us into larger battles. Summit Holdings faced criminal charges in 4 states. Richard Coulter had turned informant, providing testimony about the systematic fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. 3 executives were under indictment. The foreclosure machinery that had threatened so many families was dismantled piece by piece through prosecutions that would take years to fully resolve. But for us, the immediate threat had passed. The Rodriguez family settled their NDA lawsuit for a fraction of what Summit had demanded, with the judge noting their public interest disclosure had helped expose criminal activity. Tom Brennan weathered the political pressure and won re-election by the widest margin in county history. Sarah's veterinary practice gained new clients, ranchers who respected what she'd risked to protect the valley's water and land. As for me, I was learning what my grandfather had known all along. That ranching wasn't a job or even a lifestyle, but a relationship with land that demanded everything and gave back meaning in return. The work never ended. Fences always needed mending. Cattle always needed attention. Equipment always needed repair. But there was satisfaction in it, a bone-deep rightness that my years in Denver had never provided. I'd hired 2 ranch hands, young guys from families that had left ranching a generation ago but whose sons were hungry to return to it. Teaching them felt like passing on something my grandfather had given me, knowledge that lived in hands and instinct more than words. How to read weather in the way grass bent. How to know a sick calf by the set of its ears. How to move through the land gently enough that you became part of it rather than an intrusion. Winter settled in hard, the way it does in the high country. I spent long evenings in the ranch house, finally making it mine. Repainting rooms. Replacing furniture. Hanging photographs that included my own memories alongside the family history on the walls. The house felt alive again, one with purpose rather than just occupied space, marking time until the end. On Christmas Eve, I hosted dinner for everyone who'd stood with me during the fight. The Rodriguez family, the Chens, Tom Brennan and his wife, Howard Mitchell, Frank Morrison and his daughter who'd driven in from the city. The house filled with voices and laughter, the kitchen table groaning under dishes that represented 3 different cultural traditions blended into a common celebration. James Chen raised a glass near midnight. To William Reeves, who taught us that some fights are worth having. And to Jacob, who remembered what his grandfather tried to teach him. We drank to that, into the land, into the future that suddenly seemed possible again. But it was Frank Morrison's daughter, Amanda, who asked the question I had been avoiding. What happens when you're gone, Jacob? You're what, 31? Unmarried, no kids. Who carries this forward when you can't anymore? The table went quiet. It was the unspoken concern in every ranching family. You could save the land from corporations and hold it through one generation, but eventually someone had to want it enough to continue the work. I don't know, I admitted. I'm still figuring out how to keep it going myself. The future feels pretty far away when you're just trying to survive winter. Sarah Chen smiled slightly. That's what every generation says. Then somehow the land finds who it needs. Spring arrived slowly, winter releasing its grip one grudging day at a time. The calving season brought the usual chaos of new life requiring constant attention. I spent nights in the barn, helping difficult births, making sure mothers and babies bonded properly, losing some despite everything because that was the harsh reality of ranching. Life and death in constant rotation, the cycle that sustained everything. It was during calving season that I received a letter forwarded through Howard Mitchell's office. The return address was an attorney in Seattle, someone I'd never heard of representing an estate I had no connection to. Inside was a brief note and several documents that took me 3 readings to fully comprehend. The note explained that Robert Hastings, a childhood friend of my grandfather's who'd moved west decades ago and made a fortune in timber, had recently passed away. His will included a bequest to William Reeves, and since my grandfather was deceased, it passed to his heir. Me. The bequest was simple and staggering. $2 million, specifically designated for the preservation and continued operation of the Reeves Ranch, to ensure William's legacy survives into the future. I sat on my porch, the letter trembling in my hands, watching spring grass emerge green against brown earth. $2 million. Enough to modernize equipment, improve infrastructure, create an endowment that could sustain operations through bad years. Enough to ensure that financial pressure would never force what Summit's fraud couldn't accomplish. My grandfather had never mentioned this friend. Had never indicated there was any safety net beyond what we could build ourselves. But he'd maintained that friendship across decades and distance, and apparently the bond had been strong enough that a dying man in Seattle had thought about a ranch in Colorado and decided to protect it. The land finds who it needs. Sarah's words echoed in my mind. I used part of the money to create a scholarship program for young people from ranching families who wanted to study agriculture, veterinary medicine, or environmental science. Kids who felt the pull of the land but didn't see a viable future in it. Maybe we could change that equation, make it possible for more of them to come home. The rest went into improvements that would make the ranch more sustainable and efficient. Solar panels to reduce energy costs. Water conservation systems. Rotational grazing infrastructure that would improve soil health while supporting more cattle. Equipment that one person could operate rather than requiring a crew. But I also did something my grandfather might have considered frivolous. I hired a stonemason to create a proper monument in the family cemetery. Not just for my grandfather, but for everyone buried there, all the Reeves who'd worked this land across generations. Their names carved in granite that would last centuries, a permanent record that they'd been here, mattered, built something worth preserving. The dedication ceremony in late summer brought people I'd never expected. Distant cousins I'd lost touch with decades ago, traveling from 4 states to stand on land their ancestors had claimed. Neighbors from surrounding ranches, paying respects to a family that had been part of the valley's fabric since before Colorado was a state. Even some of the ranch hands my grandfather had employed over the years, old men now, but remembering him with the kind of respect that couldn't be bought or faked. We stood in the cemetery as afternoon light slanted across the mountains, and I read from my grandfather's journal. Not the parts about Summit Holdings or the fight to protect the land, but earlier entries about what the work meant to him. About finding peace in the rhythm of seasons. About understanding that you didn't own land so much as belonged to it. About the satisfaction of doing work that mattered beyond your own lifetime. He taught me that legacy isn't what you leave behind, I concluded. It's what you protect while you're here. The land doesn't need us. But we need it. And our job is to be good caretakers for the time we're given, so the land can sustain whoever comes next. After everyone left, I stood alone among the graves, running my hand over the new monument. My grandfather's name was there, solid and permanent. But there was space left at the bottom. Room for my name someday. And after that, room for whoever came next. The thought didn't frighten me the way it might have a year ago. I'd learned that death wasn't an ending but a transition. My grandfather was gone, but his work continued through me. Someday I'd be gone, and the work would continue through someone else. The land was the constant. We were just temporary caretakers, each generation adding to what came before, protecting and preserving for what came after. Fall arrived with the sharp clarity unique to mountain country. The hay was stored, the cattle prepared for winter, the equipment serviced and ready. I'd made it through a full year of ranching on my own, and the ranch had not only survived but improved. The land was healthier. The herd was stronger. The infrastructure was modernized while respecting the traditions that had sustained it. On the anniversary of my grandfather's death, I rode to the north pasture where they'd found him. Someone, probably Tom Brennan, had placed a small marker where he'd fallen. I dismounted and stood there for a long time, the fence he'd been mending now solid and strong, maintained with the care he'd always insisted on. I understand now, I told him, speaking to the wind and the grass and the mountains that held memory better than stone. Why you stayed. Why you fought. Why it mattered so much that I come home. This isn't just land. It's connection. Purpose. Proof that some things are bigger than any individual life. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals rising from sun-warmed earth. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, the same breeds my great-great-grandfather had first brought to this valley. The grass bent in wind that had blown across these mountains for millennia before humans arrived and would blow for millennia after we were gone. But while we were here, we mattered. Our choices shaped what the land became. Our work determined whether it would be protected or destroyed, sustained or exploited, passed on or sold off to the highest bidder. My grandfather had made his choice. He'd chosen to protect and preserve, to fight against forces that saw only resources to extract and profits to maximize. He died making that choice, working fence line on land he loved more than his own comfort or safety. Now I'd made the same choice. Not because I'd inherited the ranch, but because I'd learned what it meant. The land had taught me through seasons and struggle, through work that broke me down and built me back differently. I was a rancher now, not by birth alone but by choice and understanding. As I rode back toward the house in fading afternoon light, I thought about the future. Maybe I'd marry someday, have children who'd grow up knowing this land the way I had. Maybe I'd find someone who understood that you didn't just marry a person, you married a place, a way of life, a commitment that extended beyond individual happiness to generational responsibility. Or maybe the land would find its next caretaker some other way. Through the young ranch hands I was training. Through one of the scholarship recipients who'd discover ranching wasn't a dying profession but an evolving one. Through someone I hadn't met yet who was searching for the same thing I'd been searching for when I left Denver, purpose and belonging in work that mattered. What I knew with certainty was that the ranch would continue. Summit Holdings had tried to take it and failed. Financial pressure had threatened it and been overcome. My own absence had left it vulnerable, but I'd returned in time. The land had survived all of it, waiting patiently for someone ready to understand and protect it. 400 acres of Colorado high country. Cattle and grass and mountains and water running clear through creeks that remembered everyone who'd ever drunk from them. Soil enriched by generations of careful work. Fences mended and remended until the wire itself was almost irrelevant compared to the knowledge of where boundaries should be. This was what my grandfather had protected. This was what I would protect now. And someday, when my time came to be buried in that cemetery beside him, someone else would stand where I was standing and understand the weight and the privilege and the responsibility of being caretaker to land that sustained everything. The ranch house lights appeared in the distance, warm and welcoming. Home. Not just a building or a piece of property, but the physical manifestation of belonging to a place that had chosen me as much as I'd chosen it. I thought about my grandfather's final journal entry. They think they can wait me out. They don't understand what this land means. He'd been right. They hadn't understood. But I did now. Finally, completely, without reservation. The land meant continuity and resistance and the quiet insistence that some things were worth protecting regardless of cost. It meant knowing your place in a chain of caretakers that stretched back generations and forward into a future you'd never see. It meant work that broke your body but sustained your spirit. It meant belonging to something bigger than yourself and being responsible for its continuation. As darkness settled over the valley and stars emerged in the vast mountain sky, I stood on the porch one last time before going inside. Tomorrow would bring more work. More challenges. More seasons to navigate and survive. But tonight, I stood with gratitude for the fight we'd won and the land we'd saved and the understanding I'd finally gained. My grandfather had waited 23 years for me to come home. He'd died before seeing it happen, but his faith had been justified. I was home now. Truly home. And the land he'd loved and protected would continue into the future, not unchanged by everything that had happened, but alive and breathing and sustained by people who understood what it meant to be caretakers of something worth preserving. The Reeves Ranch would endure. That was my grandfather's legacy. That was my responsibility. That was the promise carved in stone and written in soil and carried forward by everyone who understood that land didn't belong to people, people belonged to land. And in that belonging, we found everything that mattered. Purpose. Connection. Legacy. Home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.